For 8 seasons, tens of millions of Americans tuned in every week to watch a masked man and his silent, dignified native companion ride across the frontier. The Lone Ranger was one of the most popular shows on early television, and the man riding beside him, the one who rarely got top billing, rarely got paid fairly, and rarely got to speak in his own voice, was a real Mohawk man named Harold J. Smith. The world knew him as Jay Silverheels. And underneath the buckskin, the paint-free but still stereotyped role, and the friendly public smile, was a man who spent his entire career fighting a system that only wanted to use half of who he was. This is a story of how a poor kid from a reserve in Ontario became the first Native American actor to play a major Native character on American television, why he grew to despise the name that made him famous, and how he eventually used his fame to build something that would outlast the show that made him. Harold J. Smith was born on May 26, 1912, on the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve near Brantford and Hagersville, Ontario, the largest First Nations reserve in Canada. He was one of at least 10 children in a Mohawk family that struggled financially from the very beginning. His father, Alexander George Edwin Smith, had served in the Canadian military during the First World War and came home decorated for bravery, but also came home changed. The war had cost him his hearing and left him in constant pain, and the small government pension he received was nowhere near enough to support a family that size. Harold's mother held the household together, relying on traditional knowledge and community support in a system that offered the family little else. Poverty was the backdrop of Harold's entire childhood, but so was talent. He grew up on a reserve with a deep lacrosse tradition, a sport the Haudenosaunee people consider a sacred gift, and by the time he was a teenager, it was obvious he had a rare gift for it. He also grew up during an era when Canadian residential schools were actively working to strip Indigenous children of their language and culture, a policy that touched his extended family and shaped how the world around him treated Native people. Officials of the era openly described Indigenous communities as lacking ambition or ability. That was the world Harold Smith was raised to prove wrong. By his late teens, Harold was already playing professional box lacrosse, a fast and physical version of the game, for teams around Ontario and later in the United States. During the worst years of the Great Depression, his family relocated to Buffalo, New York, chasing whatever work and opportunity they could find. It was during this stretch, playing for lacrosse clubs across the northeastern United States, that Harold picked up the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. Teammates noticed that when he ran, his new pale-colored cleats seemed to flash with every stride. They started calling him Silverheels, and it stuck so firmly that newspapers began printing it instead of his given name. He wasn't just fast. He was a genuine star, drawing crowds and press attention as a professional athlete years before Hollywood ever noticed him. He also boxed competitively, reaching the semifinals of the Golden Gloves tournament at Madison Square Garden as a middleweight before a devastating punch broke his jaw and ended that chapter of his athletic career. Through it all, he kept working odd jobs on the side because a paycheck from sports in the 1930s, even a good one, rarely lasted long. In 1937, while touring Los Angeles with his lacrosse team, Harold's speed and athleticism caught the eye of comedian Joe E. Brown, who was watching from the sidelines of the stadium where the team was practicing. Brown encouraged him to try film work. It wasn't long before Harold was picking up small stunt jobs around the studios. He performed diving catches and physical stunts that Hollywood was happy to pay for, and the money, while modest, was often better than what lacrosse provided. He joined the Screen Actors Guild and began using the name Jay Silverheels professionally. Work was inconsistent, and the roles were almost always small. An unnamed warrior here, a background extra there. Studios liked that his name sounded, in their words, exotic, and pushed him to use it rather than his birth name. He was frequently asked to appear shirtless for casting calls, judged as much on his physique as his acting ability. It was degrading, but it was also, for a native actor in that era, one of the only doors open at all, and he walked through it. Silverheels served during the Second World War, though detailed records of his service are thin, and returned to an industry that had barely shifted in his absence. Native roles were still routinely handed to white actors wearing makeup, while actual Native performers were pushed into the background even in stories that were supposedly about them. He kept auditioning anyway, learning to read Shakespeare on a friend's advice because, as a friend told him, if he could handle that, he could handle anything a script threw at him. While Silverheels' film career slowly built, he continued touring with lacrosse teams through parts of the American South, and what he experienced there stayed with him. Hotels refused him rooms. Restaurants turned him away. He slept on the team bus while his white teammates checked into hotels without a second thought. In at least one instance, in Louisville, police confronted him simply for using a restroom marked for white patrons only. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the ordinary texture of touring as a native man in mid-century America. It's part of why, decades later, once he had a real platform in the entertainment industry, he chose to spend it pushing for better treatment and better roles for native performers rather than simply enjoying his own success. His breakthrough came in 1948, when acclaimed director John Huston cast him in Key Largo alongside Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall. Silverheels played Tom Osceola, one of two Seminole brothers in the film, and for the first time in over a decade of scattered stunt and extra work, he received a genuine screen credit in a major studio picture. 2 years later, he appeared as Geronimo in Broken Arrow, a western that presented itself as a more sympathetic portrayal of Native Americans, but still cast a white actor from Brooklyn in the lead native role. In makeup, while relegating the Apache people actually hired for production to background extra work. Even in a film trying to do better, the industry's old habits held firm. Silverheels brought as much dignity to Geronimo as the material allowed, but the contradiction of the situation wasn't lost on him or on audiences paying close attention. In 1949, when the Lone Ranger radio serial made the jump to ABC television, producers held auditions for the role of Tonto. For nearly 2 decades on radio, the character had been voiced entirely by white actors. When television producers first considered casting an actual native performer, the process reportedly stalled. One candidate was let go for refusing to perform in the exaggerated broken English the producers wanted. Silverheels beat out dozens of other actors for the part, and on September 15, 1949, he became the first Native American actor to portray a major Native character on American television. It was a landmark moment in an industry that, up to that point, had frequently painted non-Native actors with makeup to simulate indigenous features rather than simply hiring indigenous actors. But the victory came with a bitter irony baked directly into the role. In Spanish, the word Tonto means foolish or stupid, and Silverheels was fully aware of it. He wore the name publicly with a smile for television cameras and press junkets, but privately, the irony gnawed at him. Years later, during a visit back to his home reserve in Ontario, a reporter asked him about his most famous role. His answer was blunt and brief. He said the character was stupid. It wasn't a throwaway comment. It was a rare, unfiltered glimpse into how he actually felt about the character that had made him a household name, a feeling that resurfaced publicly whenever the debate about the name and the stereotype flared back up in later decades, including when the role was revisited by a new generation of actors and controversy followed all over again. Beyond the name itself, Silverheels chafed at the stiff, broken English dialogue the writers gave Tonto, dialogue meant to sound authentic, but which bore little resemblance to how he or any of the native people he knew actually spoke. He developed a reputation for reworking his lines on set, trimming them down into the clipped, simplified phrasing audiences remember, not because he couldn't handle more complex dialogue, but because he refused to perform the version the writers had put on the page. Accounts from people on set described at least one director losing his temper badly enough over Silverheels departing from the script that he had to be physically restrained from confronting him. Clayton Moore, who played the Lone Ranger and worked alongside Silverheels for the entire run of the series, reportedly defended his co-star's instincts, arguing the altered lines sounded more natural. Silverheels understood something the writers didn't want to hear, that authenticity and stereotype are not the same thing, and Hollywood at the time was only interested in the second one. The production itself ran on a tight budget, and for a long stretch of the show's early run, Silverheels and Moore didn't even have proper dressing rooms, reportedly having to change costumes in a gas station restroom near the filming location. Shooting in the heat of Southern California in heavy wool and suede costumes was miserable, and at one point Silverheels simply refused to get dressed for the day's filming until conditions improved. Moore warned him the delay could put jobs at risk, but Silverheels held his ground. The production relented, and proper dressing facilities followed. It was a small moment, but it reflected something bigger. Silverheels was never simply the passive, agreeable figure the character of Tonto was written to be. The show became a genuine hit, ranking among the top-rated programs on American television during its early seasons and staying popular for years, eventually running to 221 episodes over 8 seasons. Yet even as the show thrived, the pay gap between its two stars remained wide, with Silverheels earning roughly half of what Moore was paid for the same series. In 1955, during a stunt rehearsal, Silverheels suffered a heart attack, serious enough to keep him off the show for around 2 months. Despite a lifetime as a competitive athlete, years of heavy smoking had caught up with him. Writers explained his character's sudden absence from the storyline by saying Tonto had traveled to Washington to meet with government officials, a plot device that quietly mirrored the real power imbalance running underneath the entire show. At home, Silverheels was Harold Smith's husband and father. His first marriage to Bobby Smith ended in divorce in the early 1940s and left him largely estranged from 2 of his children as wartime service, and unstable film work pulled him in different directions. In the mid-1940s, he married Mary Doma, an Italian-American woman, and the two stayed together for the rest of his life, raising 4 more children together in Southern California. He was known to joke about the mix of cultures in his household, but underneath the humor was a man who never stopped identifying deeply with his Mohawk heritage. His own grandfather had been a Mohawk chief, a fact that stood in sharp contrast to the simplified, generic Indian characters Hollywood kept asking him to play. After the Lone Ranger television series ended its run in 1957, Silverheels reprised Tonto twice more on the big screen, in The Lone Ranger in 1956 and The Lone Ranger and The Lost City of Gold in 1958. Both did reasonably well at the box office, but neither reversed the deeper problem. The role had defined him so completely that studios rarely offered him anything else. Through the 1960s, he kept working steadily in television westerns, appearing on shows like Wagon Train, Rawhide, Laramie, and Daniel Boone, almost always in some variation of the same type of role. At the same time, the growing native rights movement of the 1960s began openly criticizing the very character that had made him famous. Scholars and activists described Tonto as a demeaning stereotype, and some activist circles started using the name itself as an insult, comparing its function to other derogatory terms used against marginalized groups in that era. Silverheels found himself in an uncomfortable position. The character had opened doors no native actor had walked through before him, yet many in his own community now saw it as part of the problem. Rather than retreat from the criticism or simply cash in on his fame, Silverheels responded by building an institution. In the early 1960s, he helped found what became the Indian Actors Workshop in Los Angeles, working alongside other Native performers to give aspiring actors a place to train in acting, voice work, and stunt performance, skills the industry rarely bothered teaching Native talent directly. By the mid-1960s, the workshop was holding regular sessions, and it became a genuine pipeline for Native performers trying to break into the industry on better terms than he had. One of its students, Michael Horse, would go on to play Tonto himself years later, and later became known for his role in Twin Peaks. Silverheels believed change would come faster through access than through protest alone. He was skeptical that boycotts, a tactic that had power in other civil rights movements, would carry the same economic weight for Native communities, given their smaller population and market presence. So he worked the system from the inside, writing directly to government officials and network executives urging better portrayals of Native Americans on screen, while also using the workshop to address broader community concerns. In the 1970s, Silverheels took up harness racing, earning a provisional driver's license and training horses, a pursuit that let him stay close to the athleticism that had defined his youth. But in 1975, a series of strokes left him partially paralyzed, and a subsequent stroke the following year badly affected his speech. Still, in July 1979, just months before his death, he received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. He attended the ceremony in a wheelchair, surrounded by Native dancers, and managed only a few quiet words of thanks. Jay Silverheels died on March 5, 1980, at the age of 67, from complications related to his strokes and pneumonia. His ashes were returned to the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario, the land where he was born, and where his story truly began. His legacy didn't end with his death. He was later inducted into the Western Performers Hall of Fame and the Canadian Lacrosse Hall of Fame, and his portrait still hangs in a Buffalo theater near where he once toured as a young athlete. More importantly, the workshop he helped build kept training Native performers for years afterward, part of the slow shift that eventually produced Oscar-nominated actors and films made by Native storytellers on their own terms. Jay Silverheels spent his career trapped inside a role built on a name he privately couldn't stand, delivering lines he didn't believe in, for a fraction of the pay his co-star received. And yet he never let that bitterness define him publicly. On a late-night talk show appearance near the end of his run as Tonto, he looked directly into the camera and turned the joke back on the audience himself, reclaiming, if only for a moment, a character that had never fully belonged to him in the first place. That instinct to take what the industry handed him and quietly bend it towards something with more dignity is the truest measure of who Jay Silverheels actually was.